to me, O Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 17. Unshakable. The arrow cut through the air, spinning slightly, and Odysseus watched it go. Time seemed to have slowed down, and he could see the suitors following the arrow, Penelope staring at him in disbelief, and Antinous looking startled, then shocked, then scared, then thwap! Time slammed back into action, and Antinous never felt anything again. There was a stunned silence from the suitors as Antinous' final breaths gurgled from his mutilated throat. With him gone, they didn't know who to turn to, and all of them were looking at each other, but after seeing what happened to Antinous, no one seemed keen. All the while, Penelope was staring at the old beggar in front of her, her mouth and eyes growing wider in unison. Then she let out a whisper that cut through the hall like a thunderclap. "Odysseus!" The silence in the hall changed tone, as all the suitors were staring at the beggar in a brand new light. They began gasping, they began pointing, some looked from the tapestry behind the throne to the man in front of them, and gradually it clicked into place. Odysseus was home, he had a bow in his hand, and he did not look happy. The hall erupted into chaos. The suitors were panicking now. Some ran for cover, others looked around the walls for weapons that were no longer there. Everywhere there was shouting and outrage and desperation, but for Odysseus, only three things mattered. He saw Eumaeus and Philoetius coming up to flank him, huge shields on their arms. He saw Eurycleia hurrying servants out of the room and shutting the doors. He saw Telemachus grab his mother by the arm and rush her to safety. And he smiled. Reaching for his next arrow, he drew the shaft back to his cheek and let it fly. Another suitor fell, then another and another and another. Telemachus was back now, and with the two herdsmen at his sides and his son at his back, Odysseus loosed arrow after arrow at the men who had threatened the lives of his wife and son. With the skill of an expert marksman, forged in peace but honed in war, each arrow found its mark. He took no joy or pleasure in the killing. This was simply a job to be done, yet another wall to overcome. When the arrows ran out, they switched to spears, then swords, and Odysseus would have used his bare hands to destroy these men if it would have been quicker. Years ago, he had sworn an oath to Athena that he would never let his rage and bloodlust get the better of him, but for tonight that oath was forgotten, and Odysseus was an animal. He tore across the hall like a fury of vengeance, and gradually, one by one, the suitors died. Some fought, some bargained, some begged, but none of it mattered. They all ended the same way. When it was done, Odysseus stood on the raised platform in front of his throne and looked over his hall. His shoulders were heaving from the effort. He was covered from head to toe in grime and gore, and his eyes roamed wildly, looking for anyone they had missed. Eventually, he turned to Eumaeus and Philoetius. "Thank you both," he said. "You put your lives on the line for me, and that shall not be forgotten. Could you send Eurycleia to me, please?" They nodded and hurried into the hallway, and Odysseus was left alone in the hall with his son. Telemachus was quiet, and Odysseus thought back to his first few weeks in the war at Troy. He'd been just a few years older than Telemachus was now, and every bit as green. He'd thought war and battle were the stuff of songs and legends, that glory surrounded warriors and victory was inevitable. Troy had stripped that illusion from him, and now he had done the same for Telemachus. "You fought well," he told the young man. "You held your nerve, and you remembered your duty. That's a lot more than a lot manage in their first flush of battle." "Was this—" Telemachus' voice caught and he cleared his throat. "Was this battle, then?" he asked. Odysseus thought back over the last hour. No, this wasn't battle. These men hadn't been armed, they hadn't been ready, they hadn't stood a chance. So what was this then, he asked himself? Justice? Vengeance? But there was only one word he knew for what had just happened. "Slaughter," said a voice in his mind. "No, son," he told Telemachus, "this was not battle. But it was necessary, and I took no joy or pleasure in it. That's important. When a man starts taking pleasure in killing, he ceases to be a man and begins to be a monster. Now, go and bathe, wash away the blood and grime of violence, and look at yourself in the mirror. Look long and hard and make peace with the man you see looking back at you. If you can do that, you'll be all right." That had been a hard-won lesson for him, and he hoped his son would find it more easily than he had. Telemachus nodded and left the room, and as he did, Eurycleia came in. She stopped in the doorway, taken aback by the blood and chaos around her, and her eyes widened at the sight of Odysseus coated in gore. Then she spat on the ground and gave a curt nod. "That's a job well done, as far as I can see," said the old woman. "You're not hurt, are you, my lord?" "No, I'm fine, thank you," said Odysseus. "Nanny, you've been faithful to this household all this time, and I thank you for that. I'm aware not everyone in my care will have been so, though. Could you fetch me every servant, slave, and soldier who has been disloyal to my wife and son while I was away? It's time for a reckoning." Eurycleia nodded and left the room. "And just exactly when," asked a voice behind him, "were you going to consult me about your reckoning?" Odysseus turned slowly and saw Penelope staring at him with fire in her eyes. He suddenly felt ashamed. He hadn't wanted her to see him like this, like a dog of war still fresh from the kill. He'd wanted to dispense justice, set the house in order, and then come to her bathed and fresh and smiling like the man she remembered. "You weren't supposed to see me like this," he muttered. "Like what?" she responded. "Like a killer? I'm not naive, Odysseus. You were at war for 10 years and God's knows where for another 10. I understand there will be blood on your hands, but now you have brought it into my house, and without even telling me your plans." Odysseus was stung. My house, she had said, as if it wasn't his any longer. And perhaps she was right. "I wanted to protect you," he said in a quiet voice. "It may have escaped your notice," Penelope said, each word a shard of ice, "but I have been living without your protection for 20 years, and I have learned I am not made of glass." Her tone softened a little, but there was still iron behind it. "I am not the same woman you left behind 20 years ago, and you can't expect me to become her again the moment you get home." Odysseus stared at her, and once again he thought how foolish he'd been. In his mind, the world of Ithaca had been completely on hold in his absence, all neatly sealed up in a wax-stopper jar, waiting for him to come back and let it breathe again. Somehow it had never occurred to him that Penelope would learn to live without him. He took a long look at the tapestry of his face she had woven, staring down at him accusingly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not the man I was 20 years ago either. But I hope you can find a place for the man that I've become." Penelope stared at him, and once again he wished he wasn't covered in blood from the slaughter. But maybe it was better this way. Maybe now she could see him at his very worst, and if she could still accept him, then maybe there was hope. She drew breath to speak, but he didn't get the chance to hear what she might have said, because at that moment Eurycleia came in, with a row of people following behind. As they entered the room, they took in the sight of the brutal bloodshed and gasped as they saw Odysseus standing by his throne covered in gore and grime. Nervously, knowing their lives depended on it, they bowed and knelt before him. Odysseus looked at Penelope, and he thought about what she'd said and who she'd become, and he spoke. "You are all here because in my absence you did not support this household as others did. You were unsupportive to my son. You were disloyal to my wife. But since it is her that you were disloyal to, it is not for me to pass judgment. That duty falls to her. Pray she is more merciful than I am." And Odysseus noticed several eyes darting towards the heaped bodies strewn around the room. "Queen Penelope, they are yours to command." At the mention of her name, Penelope looked surprised. But then she nodded, and Odysseus noticed her straighten her back and square her shoulders as she addressed the penitent people waiting on her justice. Some she forgave and set to cleaning the hall, some she sentenced to punishment or imprisonment, some she sentenced to death. But Odysseus saw that all of them respected her commands as absolute, and no glance was given to him to override her words. "She really has led the kingdom in my absence," he thought. "Every time I think I know everything there is to know about her, she surprises me more." And once again his respect for the woman he had married grew. Hours later, finally bathed and shaved, Odysseus knocked on Penelope's bedroom door. It used to be our bedroom door, he thought, but who knows now? Penelope came out to meet him, and he was struck afresh by how stunningly beautiful she was. The years have been kinder to you than to me, he thought. I just wanted to say goodnight, he said, and turned to go. Thank you, she called after him, and he halted. For respecting my place as queen today. Thank you. Odysseus looked back at her. You were magnificent, he told her. I couldn't possibly have done any better, and he walked on. Do you remember our bed? Penelope called after him. Odysseus stopped and turned. Do I remember our bed? He asked. Of course I remember our bed. I built our bed. We had an olive tree growing through the wall of our room, and you didn't want it cut down, so we built our bed as part of it, and you told me the roots of this tree will be like the roots of our marriage, deep, strong, and unshakable. She finished his words. Do you think we were right? She asked. About the marriage, not the tree. Are the roots deep and strong? Are we unshakable? There's only one way to find out, I suppose, said Odysseus. We keep feeding it and see what fruit grows. He stepped closer to her and held out his hand, in that moment more vulnerable than he had been at any time in the last 20 years. She stepped closer to him and took it, and they smiled at each other, and in those smiles they could see at once the same hopeful youths they had been, so full of dreams, and the same tempered adults they'd become, so full of cares. Odysseus looked out of a nearby window and saw an owl staring back at him. It had deep grey eyes, and as he looked, it gave a wink and flew away. He smiled. Go slowly with me, Penelope asked him. I've had to put up a few more walls since you've been away. Odysseus smiled at her, warmth and wonder in his eyes. I'm good at overcoming walls, he told her. Quite famous for it, actually.